Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Air Marshal Godfrey and Deborah, who, in addition to being a great board member for Future Space Leaders, is also the head of U.S. Space Systems at Airbus U.S. Space and Defense. So we really appreciate that conversation and context. As we transition to our next panel, I want to recognize again the sponsors who make the event happen, who are supporting not just the coffee and cupcakes, but also the fellowships that we give out. So thank you again to Advanced Space, Bryce Tech, Voyager Tech, WSBR, and Hogan Lovells. So now I'd like to introduce another great and active member of our space community, Rich Dalbello, who's a principal of RDB Space. Prior to joining, or to establishing, RDB Space, Rich served as the director of the Office of Space Commerce, where he was responsible for managing the Department of Commerce's effort to establish a space traffic coordination system to ensure the safe space operations for commercial and international civil space ventures. As we just heard, consequences in space are not limited. I think collateral impacts happen, and so that program was established to mitigate those impacts. In addition to that, Rich was responsible for the regulation of the U.S. commercial remote sensing industry and generally supporting the interaction, as we talked about in the lunar panel, of commercial industry, and how that is supporting government interests. He's also served in the Office of Science Technology Policy, been a senior executive at GXO, Virgin, Intelsat, and the Satellite Industry Association. I think back, referring to something Clay had mentioned earlier, back when Geo was like the only cool kid on the block. Now a lot has changed since those days, I think. So Rich will be moderating a really esteemed panel titled From Transition to Transformation, Lessons from Past Inflection Points in the U.S. Space Policy. He'll introduce our panelists, but I challenge everyone here to really engage. As we've talked about, there's a lot of opportunity ahead for the space industry, also a lot of change, and so the hope for this panel is that we'll cover some of the lessons learned from prior transitions and really figure out how to set us as individuals, but also hopefully as a nation, set ourselves up for a bright future in this area. So welcome Rich and the panelists that join me up here. Thank you.
If the panelists could come up, our august panel. Good afternoon. As he said, I'm Richard Dalbello. I've been around longer than you can imagine. We are talking about transitions. If you're going to work in this industry, one of the things you got to get comfortable with is the fact that there are going to be these wild, unpredictable events that are going to happen that are totally going to reorient your life. And this happens in Washington because of budget reasons. It happens because of political changes. We have the most excellent panel. First of all, tremendous experience on this panel. We're going to get into some really deep and complicated issues. So there have been, over the last 4 decades, profound programmatic shifts in the United States space policy. Sometimes these were driven by the fact that large programs, such as the space shuttle, came to an end. Other times they were driven, like the Biden administration's decision to cancel the Constellation program, they were driven by a political decision, which eventually has profound both technical and institutional implications. And sometimes we start programs with tremendous aspirations and we just can't get there technically. And sometimes those programs linger, spend tremendous amounts of money, and then the institution that we have, which is the Broad Space Institute, decides that they're no longer valuable and they get terminated. So we're going to talk about some of those things today. We have a great panel. What I'd like to do is ask our panelists to introduce themselves, say a bit about the organization that they're associated with, and particularly what the members of that organization are looking to them for. Steve, could you kick it off?
Sure. It's working. Got a red light here now. This is good. First of all, where's Tyler Single? Are you in here, Tyler? Did he walk out already? He promised me, I'm pretty sure, that we're going to be sitting on bar stools drinking beers with you guys right now. What happened to Tyler? Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Steve Jacques. I'm the president of the National Security Space Association. We're put together as an industry organization solely focused on the national security space world. So the totality of the Department of Defense, the military users, the intelligence community, the IC, we call it that. That's what we do. We have a pretty profound, diverse set of member companies, well over 100 member companies. All the bigs, the smalls, the medium tier companies, we're all in it to support the leadership in the IC and the DoD on the national security space side. We have inside the organization, we have a very high-end think tank called the Mormon Center for Space Studies. So a lot of important papers we think come out of there. You're welcome to check on our website, nssaspace.org, nssaspace.org. A lot of those papers are in there. The think tank is named after the late and great General Tom Mormon, who was one of our king leaders in the business throughout his entire career. So that's the National Security Space Association. Thanks all for having me here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Shawn?
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shawn Barnes, and I'm with the Space Force Association. So Space Force Association is a nonprofit organization that is solely focused on advocating for the priorities of the Space Force. We've got chapters around the United States. Love to have people join those chapters. The members include our guardians. Members include civilians that are associated with the Space Force, but members also include lots of folks from industry and academia. And we've got sponsorships that would be from major industrial organizations. But unlike an industry agency or an industry organization, our primary focus is on the priorities of the Space Force and helping the Space Force to succeed. We look to educate the American public. We look to ensure that the Space Force narrative is amplified, and we look to conduct research that will further the Space Force priorities. Thanks, Rich.
David.
Thanks, Rich. Good afternoon, everyone. David Cavossa, the president of the Commercial Space Federation, formerly known as Commercial Space Flight Federation, up until about a year ago. CSF is the 501c6, so that's lobbying, advocacy, trade association for commercial space, broadly defined, and that's spaceports, commercial launch vehicles, satellite service providers, ISAM, in-space propulsion, remote sensing companies, commercial LEO destinations, Moon and Mars exploration, and many, many more areas. Just recently, an interesting company joined that is trying to do space-based solar power on the moon, space-based solar power on Earth, space-based data centers via a company called StarCloud. So very interesting group, but it's not only important to think about who CSF represents, it's also important to understand who we really don't represent. So CSF has been very focused on what we would call the true commercial space industry, which would be firm fixed price contracts, open competitive procurements, private investment being made substantially in the companies to compete for government and commercial business. So if you think about traditional space, which might look like large systems integrators, CSF really is not the voice of that sector of the industry. It's very much the voice of what might be called by some new space. So.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you all for being here. So my name is Jacques Corelli. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Planetary Society. We're a 501c3 organization based in Pasadena, California. We were founded in 1980 by a man named Carl Sagan with two of his colleagues from the Jet Propulsion Lab, Bruce Murray, who at the time was the director of JPL, and Lou Friedman, who was an orbital mechanic, helped craft the Voyager spacecraft's tour of the solar system in the 1970s and 80s. And what our founders saw in 1980, and the reason they founded our organization at the time, was they saw great public enthusiasm and interest in the space program. We had just landed on the moon. We had, Apollo Soyuz just 5 years prior. Voyager and Viking being the first spacecraft to tour the solar system and land on Mars, and saw that government support was beginning to wane. And actually, in President Reagan's first term, actually proposed complete cancellation of all space science programs in their first budget request, an effort led by their then OMB director. Seems relatively familiar to us right now. So currently, we're an organization that represents the public. Our members are people who are passionate and enthusiastic about space science, research, exploration, technology development, but they themselves, if they're members of the scientific community or engineers that's kind of on their own accord, this is to represent that public interest in space exploration. And so currently our CEO is none other than Bill Nye, the science guy, so keeping that legacy of science communication at our core. But our role is to excite the public, and my role in particular is to activate them into action. To advocate for a strong and robust program that is based on the science, that's based on good policy, that's based on strategy, that advances our understanding of the cosmos so we can know our place in space. And so I'm really delighted to be here to talk about sort of the role that these organizations play in these inflection points that we've gone through over the years. So back to you.
Thank you. Well, gone through a period of relatively calm up until recently. The first Trump administration established the Artemis program, the moon exploration program, and some subsidiary programs and policies that were largely supported through the Biden administration. All of that has changed since January. So what are you hearing from your members? What are their anxieties, and what is your organization doing in response to that?
Thanks, Rich. So I'm told that we are recording here today, so we love everything that we've seen out of the White House and the Congress. Next. It's also fun in being the spokesperson for a very diverse industry group that operates 100% on consensus. Before we take any policy positions, or before I put my neck out there and say something publicly through LinkedIn or social media, and often reminded of that by a member company from time to time that says, hey, Dave, you didn't check with me before you said that. But here's what I'll say is there's obviously been a lot of change in the last 4 to 5 months. The skinny budget that came out, more detail around the NASA budget, the reconciliation package, and the many items that are space-related in the reconciliation package. And I would tell you that even the commercial space industry is very split on what it's seeing. There aren't a lot of interest within CSF that I would say care deeply about certain aspects of the NASA budget, but at the same time, they're not going to be out there advocating aggressively to cut NASA funding. Generally, commercial space industry wants to see NASA do extremely well. We want to see NASA's budget grow, whether it be space science, space station operations, nuclear propulsion, or commercial LEO destinations and moon and Mars exploration. We want to see all of those things grow, and that's obviously not the case. So I've got many member companies that are very unhappy with specific sections of the president's budget request that have been cut. So we've tried to walk the fine line of saying, hey, White House, NASA, we sort of see where you're going with this budget. We see that you're trying to make a transition, at least when it comes to moon and Mars, to more commercial solutions going forward. And we're very pro-commercial solutions, transitioning to commercial launch vehicles and bringing on new entrants. But at the same time, we don't want to cut back too dramatically on space science. We don't want to cut back too dramatically on international cooperation on things like Gateway. We don't want to cut back too dramatically on space station operations, because we are very aggressively competing with the Chinese right now in several of those areas. And if we take one step back or slow down the pace that we're on, the Chinese are accelerating right now as we're slowing down, and that's our concern. So does that sort of give you a good opening?
Let me switch over to our national security team on my left side here. Both in the reconciliation bill and in the proposed 26 budget, the national security space community does very well, I think. And how are your members feeling about this? Do they think they have the direction and the resources that they need to achieve the pretty bold objectives that the president has been articulating?
A nice, simple question there, Rich. Thank you very much for kicking this thing off. Indeed, this administration is strongly appreciating the real threats coming upon us from China. That has been kind of a roller coaster through the last several years, even starting back with George W. Bush. During his tenure, before his tenure, there was a very famous Rumsfeld Commission that really started to make it clear that whether you like it or not, boys and girls, space is a military domain. And our adversaries are going to invest in space over time on the military side, so we need to take that seriously from this point on. 10 days later, it seems like the global war on terror kicked in when 9/11 hit us all, and all of our national attention drew over to the global war on terror and not putting energy as much as they should have on national security space. So fast forward to today where we are. There is a very general understanding, especially among members on both sides of the aisle here on the Hill, House and Senate, that it is a very different environment today in the national security space world. So it's very bipartisan in that sense, that support. The budget, there's a good side and a bad side of the budget. The base budget, setting aside reconciliation for a moment, is underfunded, probably about a factor of 100%. General Saltzman, the Chief of Space Operations, Secretary Frank Kendall in the prior administration, basically have said that, and they're correct. There's so much that has to be done to ensure that our systems out there that ultimately protect the warfighters on the ground and in the air are protected. Our systems are very elaborate on orbit. Not all of them are properly protected as the way they should be in the advent that a conflict does arise. Heaven forbid that would happen. If those systems go down, and we believe that China is looking at the space capabilities being their first targets, if they go down, we have big problems, big problems on the ground. Golden Dome. I think maybe you all have heard of Golden Dome. Have we heard about Golden Dome? Anybody here not heard about Golden Dome? I would say that the Golden Dome is the Space Defense Initiative, SDI, revisited from the 80s. And those of you may know about that. We kind of stopped short of really populating the full SDI when things kind of happened towards the end of the Reagan administration, to where he banged on the wall to say, Mr. Gorbachev, take this wall down, you may recall. We also think that we outspent the Russians, and they knew that they couldn't catch us. So I think the thematic of Golden Dome is picking up where we left off in the past. There are certain things like space-based interceptors that were in the SDI menu at the time. Those things just did not happen. So time will tell. As you can see probably in some of the reconciliation packages out there, there's an additional $25 billion on top of the existing budget just in 26 alone. 25 reconciliation, of course, and the 26 budget alone that's dedicated to Golden Dome. It's not perfectly clear where all those dollars are. We're going to find that all out over time. But we do believe across the next few years there's going to be a tremendous amount of investment on that side. So overall, the national security space business is very busy. And there's a great deal that hopefully General Gutlein, who will be the next director, we hope, after confirmation by the Senate, gets the ball going, and no doubt there's going to be a lot of attention on that program.
Shawn, I note that for those of you who may not be attuned to budget talk, after DoD articulates the elements of the program within the budget, they also create another list called the unfunded priorities list. And that's where they say there are things we would do in addition if we had additional resources. Shawn, I note that the Space Force has a pretty long list in the unfunded list category, and maybe you could speak to what's in that box and where do you think they're coming up short?
Yeah, so when I look at what the Space Force's priorities are and the budget that they have, the first thing that they need to do is they need to recapitalize and build a resilient set of capabilities that sort of exist today, right? So whether it's missile warning or communication or PNT or weather, and so all of that, which was developed for a benign environment, needs to be recapitalized and needs to be done in a resilient way. And so they have a significant amount of money that is going to have to go toward that. Then they have a whole bunch of new mission that is being handed to them. So as the Air Force and other services determine that they can't logically do the kinds of things that they have done for many, many years, like flying big fixed-wing aircraft into threat environments and do ISR, they have to take on that new mission because now it's being pushed to space. And so that's additive mission to what they had before. And then finally, and probably most importantly, and while I don't speak for the Chief of Space Operations, I think that he would probably say that he's got to be able to own the domain, right? He's got to be able to defend the domain. He's got to be able to ensure that he can hold the adversary's space assets at risk. And that's an area that I think has not received the amount of attention that it deserves. Just like we do in the air domain, we've got to be able to control that. And so we've got to be able to control the space domain before we can adequately operate in it. And so I think that's where you're going to see a majority of what will be in the CSO's unfunded priority list.
All right. Jacques, shifting over to you. Unlike national security space, the new administration has brought what I might call an increased skepticism to the budget when it comes to space science. And space science budget was hit pretty hard. So where's your organization on this issue? What are your members saying? What are you trying to accomplish right now?
Hit pretty hard is an understatement, and that's saying something. The budget request for NASA's Science Mission Directorate, the 30% of NASA's annual budget that handles the science missions, gets hit with 47% cut, and that includes a cancellation of 41 projects, 19 of which are in active operation currently throughout the solar system. Perfectly healthy, returning down data, being supported by ground operations. Just shut off, could be shut off overnight, would be an incredible waste of my money as a taxpayer and your money, and the money appropriated by the folks in this in these hallowed chambers. Our members are upset. Our constituencies, the people that grew up on a vision for space exploration, that's lowercase v, vision for space exploration, not to be confused with President Bush's policy, but have been brought up with this idea that we as a country are committed to exploring the cosmos, to advance technology, to solve problems that have never been solved before, to answer questions that have eluded us for millennia. And to see in just the span of a few months, just the wanton destruction of that program with no regard for what that means for international competitiveness. I mean, if you look at China's space science program, it's almost a mirror image of what we've laid out in planetary science and earth science, heliophysics, astrophysics, but they're willing to put their money where their mouth is. And the US has been in the past. This is an overwhelmingly bipartisan issue. But yeah, you look at economic development. I mean, this is NASA science hits just about every congressional district, but for sure every state, 377 congressional districts to be exact, that there is spending by our science programs at NASA on grants, on contracts, subcontracts, all throughout the space ecosystem. And so there's the economic prosperity that comes with exploring the cosmos, the joy of discovery, right? The sublime feeling of looking out into the unknown and understanding just a little bit more than our previous generations had. And then there's the national security and national posture angle. And so for all of those reasons, for one or any of them, our members are upset. And I know members of Congress that are deeply upset on both sides of the aisle, because this is what has made NASA synonymous with ingenuity and perseverance and curiosity. Maybe that's why we name our Mars vehicles after those words. So what have we been doing? Organizing with some of the folks here on this stage, letters and actions to call on Congress to take their rightful Article 1, Section 9 authority of appropriating funds from the Treasury, and appropriating funds in a smart way that advances these core ideals that we have, that the nation should pursue these deep questions. I'll say this to the room. We've activated more people in just the past 6 months through our advocacy program than we have in any year. That's the end of that sentence. 70,000 letters have gone out just in the past 6 months, and most of that since February. So this is the time that our organization is standing up, that, as we saw in the reconciliation package, which was, I feel like, the first real rejection of the president's budget request, with the addition of that $10 billion supplemental for primarily the Artemis program. And what we're going to see tomorrow in the Senate markup is going to be indicative of that continued rejection of this wanton destruction that ultimately, in President Trump's first term, we made major strides, not just the creation of Artemis and the Artemis Accords, but the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope, a huge flagship mission for the science community. Launch of the Perseverance rover. We saw the initiation of projects up and down the portfolio that are going to advance our understanding of the cosmos. The president is enthralled by space. In both the joint address and the inaugural address mentions exploration of Mars as something that captures his interest. Off the cuff will mention space exploration as a key thing that the government should be invested in. So this retreat, this surrendering of the solar system to China, is coming from one place, and that's the Office of Management and Budget. And so we are targeting our actions to activate our colleagues on the Hill, to activate the global network that we've built up over our 45 years of existence, and work with partners like the folks here to advance space science and exploration for all of us.
Very good. I have more questions, but I also want to engage the audience. So if you all have questions, please feel free to jump in and let me know yes, please.
I'm Jacques. I'm here with the Patty Gray Smith Fellowship and with Bryce Tech. The space policy realm has a lot of different players from academia, trade organizations, and service branches. And one that's popped up over the past few years, again, is the National Space Council. And I'm curious, in a very different time, if the national, if a,
David, do you want that one?
I'll start. I think we will see a National Space Council here get reinstituted, stood back up in some way, shape, or form. I think within the next 6 to 12 months. I don't know when exactly, but there's definitely lots of people within the White House and the Office of the Vice President, Office of Science and Technology Policy, talking about this right now. And I think everyone generally agrees that there's definitely value to the National Space Council existing and getting together, a deliberative body at the secretary level several times a year, led by the vice president, to talk about, the national interest of having, a very aggressive space policy, and what are the big issues regulatory-wise, that are in the way that we can deliberate at that level and start to move forward on. So I think that's happening as we speak. I haven't seen anything yet that tells me it's imminent any day now, but I think we will see that. And again, to Jack's point a few moments ago, I think this president and a lot of folks within this administration love space. I really do. I think they like space. They're excited about the idea of seeing, U.S. astronauts stepping foot back on the moon and eventually on Mars again. And I think they want to see it, or they want to be very much responsible for it during their tenure in office. So I think we will see more. I just think there's so much going on right now with reconciliation packages and tariffs and many other things, Ukraine, that I just think that hasn't been the top priority right now, and that there are other people, sort of leading the budgetary process right now. And as soon as we have a NASA administrator, and as soon as we have some of these other key individuals in place, and I think Congress has an opportunity here in the next couple of days and very soon to put its imprint on this as well.
Steve and Shawn, since part of this program is to help young entrants into the space industry understand how things work, even with a space council, the National Security Council in the White House typically plays a bigger role on national security space than the Space Council does. Maybe you could take just a second and talk to that. I know you both have practical experience in that area.
Yeah, I think you've got that quite right, Richard. There's a dynamic that exists between the National Security Council and the National Space Council, and it's not that the National Space Council reports to the National Security Council, but if you look at all of the councils that are out there, the National Security Council is by far the most important and influential within any White House. The National Space Council, however, and I agree with the earlier comments, I think the National Space Council probably will come back. I think it will be an important forum. And I think one of the interesting pieces that they'll have to work out is what is their relationship with the National Security Council to ensure that there's appropriate lanes in the road and appropriate roles and responsibilities moving forward. Steve?
Both good comments from David and Shawn. For what it's worth, the association is 100% behind keeping the council alive and well. We get a sense that there are hints that it will be kept alive. Each administration has used it in slightly different ways. But certainly at the end of the day, as Shawn mentioned, and I will say based on the experience of the last two administrations, I don't remember sensing any real friction at all between the NSC and the Space Council. They were working very much hand in hand in a very collaborative way, along with their colleagues in OMB. That's a bit of a triangular there up at the White House level. It's been very, very helpful. It's been very, very productive. It was great that the Biden administration continued it after Trump 1.0, brought it back from years past. That's all good signs. So the real question, I think, is going to be, to what extent will the council, if it is pulled back together, and I agree with both folks that I think it will come back, how big will it be? How significant will the president take it on as a priority? Vice, perhaps, on our side, if you will, on the NSC side, the national security side, maybe he might defer more to the National Security Council.
Great. I'll ask one more question, and then we'll go to the floor for a question. Let's start with David, but this is open to anybody. NASA has seen some rough transitions. I think one of the hardest was when they terminated the shuttle program. 10,000 people lost their jobs. The economy of Central Florida was seriously impacted. NASA really wobbled for a bit. And it took them a long, long time to recover and develop the commercial crew and cargo programs. So there was a long period where the U.S. had no access to space except through technologies that were origin in Russia. So looking at that experience, we know we're about to enter a period when the space station is reaching the end of its life. And I was just wondering, in light of what the nation and the aerospace community went through following the shuttle program. Is there any preparation that you know of to get ready for the end of the space station program?
I mean, there's definitely preparation going on. Obviously, we've seen some money put forward for the U.S. deorbit vehicle, which will deorbit the space station. And there is a draft RFP being developed for the replacement to the space station, the commercial LEO destinations. There's a couple of contracts out there right now for tests there, for demos. I think when you look at the future of LEO, whether that be a US-based space station or several commercial stations, I think the future looks a lot more commercial. You know, the handful of CLD providers out there today are doing a great job of sort of working around the world and finding lots of interest from pharmaceutical companies and manufacturing companies and foreign governments and their interest to have their astronauts on board, that they're building a marketplace for commercial LEO. What they're looking for, Rich, is a more aggressive push by NASA to move forward, recognizing that 2030 there probably isn't going to be an International Space Station anymore. We don't want to have a gap, so there needs to be a commercial LEO destination or two pretty far along at that point in time. So we want to see NASA, even without an administrator in place, move forward very quickly with their draft RFP and their RFP.
I mean, I think this goes to the core of the conversation that we're having about inflection points is, and maybe even just tying into the last question about the National Space Council, every successful transition in US space policy has been built around consensus, has been built around intentionality about strategy, and I think maybe we see that with the end of shuttle, that there was no no plan going into that moment. I mean, there were plans, but there was no real plan executed going into that moment. But now looking at the retirement of the ISS, looking at sort of the shift towards commercial service providers, the shift towards all of these changes that are being proposed to bring it back to the budget request, we don't see that consensus building. We don't see that strategy, and because we don't have that National Space Council, we don't see that coordination of resources and activities to meet that set of national priorities that space represents. That space policy is a representation of our greatest ambitions as a nation and represents us on a global interplanetary stage. And so we need to bring as many stakeholders to the table to build that consensus that includes Congress, that includes industry, that includes national security. The public, I would argue, is also a big part of that conversation, bringing them along. And you see, if you can go into this with strategy, intentionality, and not everyone's going to get everything that they want. I don't think anyone gets into politics thinking that they're just going to rule the world one day, but that you are willing to come to the table and come to some consensus agreement that you all get a little bit of something that advances that vision. I think that's where something like the National Space Council, that something like strategy and consensus building can come in, especially on something like ISS being such a massive projection of US dominance in space and science and exploration.
Hubble has been one of our iconic and successful programs. It's been in space now for how long? 20 plus years?
Almost 30.
So it is also arguably nearing the end of life. How does the scientific community think about big programs like that, and when it's time to turn them off? What is the process by which that's done?
So in terms of planning for new projects, the scientific community, actually starting with astrophysics, began in the 1960s with what's called the decadal surveys, which convened by the National Academies of Science, brings together the best and brightest people, solicits white papers from across the sciences to determine, based on available resources and the support that you're getting from government, and through those various mechanisms, whether it's competed missions versus directed missions or flagships, what activities we should do. And these are decadal because we're talking about time horizons that are not next quarter or next fiscal year. We're talking about things that may take 5, 10, 15 years to develop. You look at the James Webb Space Telescope, right? Launched in 2021, became fully operational in the summer of 2022. Work on it began in the summer of 1998. These things have very long time horizons. And so the space science community comes together every 10 years, decadal, to determine for planetary science, you want to get a spacecraft out to Jupiter. It's not just as easy as building the spacecraft and sending it up on a SpaceX rocket. It also has to get there. And that could be 7, 8, 9 years, depending on transit time, orientation of the planets. Physics does not abide by our annual appropriations process. It's very root of physics to do that. That is how the science community plans for that future. Now, planning for decommissioning of missions, they have something called the senior review process, where they bring in independent experts on that particular field to determine, is there a life forward for this spacecraft? Is there what they call extended mission? Should we allow this to survive for another 3 years? Are we going to continue to return on the taxpayer's investment? And a lot of times they will, because we're so dang good at building these things, they last 30, 40, 50 years in the case of something like Voyager. And so balancing those existing missions and the science with the instruments that they have on board, not very easy to replace them, with these new ideas, with new technologies and commercial providers and contracting mechanisms that change at a much faster pace than the decadal processes. I think this may be part of this inflection point that we're needing to address is 10 years enough? Or is there something, we do have the mid-decadal reviews every 5 years, but is there a way that we can retool our processes, that we can center science and the exploration of the cosmos, but also be responsive to advances in commercial capabilities and technologies at the pace that we're getting them? And we can talk forever about AI and quantum and at that point, but back to you.
Floor, I think there was a question, yes? Anything on this side? Shawn?
Well, I guess I'd say offsetting maybe some of the national level, government-led, academic-led, is this boon in commercial, right? And so, when I take a look at, who are the CEOs, who are the COOs of these commercial companies, these very, very new commercial companies, they're folks that are like 2 years older than you. There's a draw there that I think goes beyond a push from government and academia. I think we always should pay attention to where we may be losing brain trust, and there does need to be some very forward thinking on that. But at the same time, let's take advantage of the fact that there's being some market-driven changes that can be very positive as well.
David or Jack, any comment?
I mean, I'll just add, there are, maybe for us that have been in the space policy realm for a while, the lanes of activity become clearer over time, or maybe they don't. But you see the different lanes of activity of what commercial can provide, what civil space can provide, what national security can provide. That in the public perception of the space program, you kind of lose some of that nuance, and it becomes. I face this very often that it's well, NASA and commercial are head to head, and that is driving some of the sort of rhetoric that we see from people that aren't in the industry. So I think we on the inside of industry and the policy environment can always do a better job of educating the public and policymakers about what these partnerships across national security, commercial, academia, and civil space can be. But addressing the brain drain, we have to be ambitious, right? At the end of the day, you don't go into space or science because you want to work a 9-to-5 job in a cubicle, right? Like you might end up working a 9-to-5 job in a cubicle doing work for a company or academic institution, but you're getting into it because you see the value and the promise of what exploring space means. And even if you're just, part of the core of people who are just supporting a team that supports a team that does this work, like you're still part of that overall space economy. I think of the anecdote, whether it's true or not, of President Kennedy visiting Space Center down in Cape Canaveral and asking the janitor, like, so what do you do here? And he says, I'm putting a man on the moon. And we need to harness that ambition and drive and value the people that make space happen. And I think what we lose in just the wanton destruction of these programs and just saying, oh, well, it'll sort itself out. We don't need the Office of STEM engagement. The things that we do are cool enough that people will find it. It's so much more difficult now. We need to be doubling down, tripling down on the people element, because without people, none of this happens.
All right, Steve, I'd like to shift gears a little bit. There's a new crop of players, Palantir, SpaceX, Anduril, who are trying to earn their place at the table with the major primes like Lockheed and Northrop. And they're pretty creative people. Now, how do you see this competition taking shape, and does the government have a role in this?
A nice softball again, Mr. Dalbello. It is a fascinating time. And one small point I would like to make to the young lady who was just asking about human capital in the future. This is a dynamic business. The space world is exciting. There's a lot to be done. Don't let some of these policy drawdowns and investments get in your way. If you like what you're doing, there are places for you. And you think of folks like Palantir, for example. These new entrants, some of these new entrants are coming in with a real brash and bravado approach to things. And in some cases, they're really winning. The great legacy companies that have been around for a long time, the Lockheed Martins, Northrop Grumman's, Boeing's, you name them, Raytheons, they still have great mission potential. They bring a lot to our country as well. They are feeling it. There's no question they are feeling it. They're fighting it. They're trying to learn from it. I think in the long run, the nation will become stronger because of folks like Anduril and Palantir coming in. So it's a good thing. Is there enough money to go around? I'm sure, as I mentioned earlier, the top line budget for Space Force is grossly underfunded. There is still, that said, there's still a lot of money in there. We're talking in a $30 billion a year range plus Golden Dome kind of things coming on later on. So I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but that's the world we live in. The best thing for you is if you really like it, study on it as best you can, grab as many interns as you can, and get those resumes out there and try to grab a job. Once you get a good job in one of these companies, that's not your last one. You'll have other ones after that.
Okay, Shawn, another easy question for you. There have been a large number of national security programs. I'm thinking backwards in time, Future Imagery Architecture, or so-called FIA, TSAT, Transformational Satellite, I can't even remember what the last T stands for, SBIRS Low, brilliant pebbles. There have been a range of DoD programs that stood up and actually, in some cases, spent billions and then ultimately failed because the technology challenges were just greater than they could harness at that point. As you look forward, particularly through the eyes of the Space Force, what can we do better as a government and as acquisition officers? What can we do better to prevent that waste of resource?
Yeah, great question. So I would start by saying, don't strap on huge programs if you don't need to. I think technology has evolved in a way that now we're understanding the value of these large distributed constellations and how you can sort of piece build a capability in a way that from an engineering standpoint is much more straightforward. So add NPOs to the list of complex capabilities that we, in the end, didn't, couldn't, wouldn't, for some reason, field. The other thing to do is to make sure that we really understand the operational needs and don't overburden a program with a set of requirements that seem like they may be the right thing to do, but frankly end up being unachievable. And in the case of SBIRS Low, in the case of NPOs, probably in the case of FIA, we strapped on too many requirements to a single program to allow them to be successful. And instead, if you think about things in more of a system of systems manner, then you can recognize that a certain set of requirements and operational needs can be satisfied with, let's call it program A, and another set can be solved by program B, and another set can be solved by program C. Those programs have to be interoperable and integrated, but they don't all have to be a single program that solves everything. So that's the way that I would encourage the Space Force to try to get after that.
So I think that the Space Force's MILNet program has just been, I guess it existed, but I guess it's just been publicly released now or publicly being discussed. Talk a little bit about that, Shawn, and how is it relying on existing capabilities to try to achieve a more complex goal?
I'll tell you what, Richard, I'm gonna defer on that. I'm not an expert on MILNet. Steve, do you have some thoughts on that?
I only have a little bit of peripheral knowledge, some of which I'm not sure I could even share in this room at all. But it's I think leveraging some systems that are already in place, and they're being rebranded over in the Space Force side.
Okay, well, let's not all get arrested. So we'll move on to the next topic. David, it wouldn't be a gathering in Washington unless I said the words mission authorization. So one of the big gaps going forward that's been discussed, it seems to me like forever, has been the fact that the current regulatory structure in the U.S. Isn't sufficient to cover that tremendous range of new activities that you talked about in your first round of comments. Well, why don't you, for those in the audience who may not know, say a few words about what are we talking about and what is the CSF, which has played a big role in this so far. What does CSF want to see happen?
Sure. I mean, the 30-second overview is we obviously have several regulatory bodies today in the United States that regulate spectrum use, FCC, remote sensing licensing at CRISRA, part of the Office of Space Commerce. We have folks that regulate us from a perspective of export controls, whether that's Commerce, BIS, or State Department, and the FAA from the perspective of commercial space transportation, launch licensing, and Nuclear Regulatory Commission when it comes to putting nuclear batteries or things of that nature in space, and probably others that are skipping by right now in my mind. But there's a concept where there are several types of missions, several new technologies, several new ideas business plans that would not fit in any one of those buckets, or that would fit in multiple buckets and need to be regulated or licensed by potentially several entities in the U.S. government, and that's a concern for the space industry generally. We want to see those things that are broadly called, mission authorization, or it was called during the Biden administration, novel mission authorization, be given to one agency within the federal government to license that mission, or to go and reach out to all of the respective agencies and regulators and do the work internally for the government and come together with one decision. And that's the topic of mission authorization. And we very much want to see that authority be granted to the Office of Space Commerce within the Department of Commerce.
Okay, I think we are, Shawn?
Do you mind if I jump on that too? Because I think this is actually a super important issue. In the Space Force, because it will be more and more dependent on commercial capabilities, wants to see a regulatory framework that is much more rational than what we have today. I mean, think about it, if you're external to the government and you've got to go to the government and you got to go to 4 different places to get 4 different versions of license, I mean, that's just an irrational way to do business at all. The DoD is not actually a regulatory agency in that we don't regulate external behavior, regulate internal behavior to death, but we don't regulate external behavior. And so sometimes DoD is often frustrated by the regulatory agencies that are out there. But there's got to be a more rational way to do that, and our national security depends on there being a more rational way to do that.
Okay, I think we're almost out of time. I have one more question for Jacques. Public-private models have been very useful and employed now both on the NASA side and the national security space side. Are there opportunities for public-private collaborations in space science that could be meaningful going forward?
To answer it up front, absolutely. I think that's been the direction that NASA's been going in human space flight, and it's beginning to go in that direction for scientific space flight. Looking at the CLPS mission, Commercial Lunar Payload Services, which one of the 4 have successfully landed on the lunar surface. This is the idea that you can purchase a service from the commercial industry and get your set of instruments down on the surface. Now, we're very early in the testing of that as a model for those types of partnerships. But it's the enthusiasm is there from the commercial sector to provide these services. And NASA, as an anchor customer, of course, purchasing the services, but then also procuring different instrument suites on these landers, has proven to be a fruitful opportunity. The U.S. does not then have to develop its own bespoke lander for each instrument it wants to deploy. You now have this ability to partner with the commercial sector on this opportunity. And with the idea, the same with commercial LEO destinations, the same idea with commercial cargo and crew. You now have these pathways for non-governmental entities to build up their own capabilities and develop those business models based on the services available. And so that is one way that we can see the problem that doing CLPS for Mars, which CMAPS, I guess is what it would be, but that's not a great acronym, is maybe that next step, and is something considered in the president's budget request, and actually has been talked about within the Mars exploration program at NASA for some years. The problem is again, physics does not care about your annual budget cycles. You only have a window of opportunity to go to Mars every 26 months, and then going closer to the sun. You say you want to have a commercial Venus program. Difficulty there is in getting to that planet. So the further away you get, which is where I think the planetary science program at NASA mainly focuses, is on planets other than Earth, worlds other than Earth. Sorry to the moons out there. is that it becomes increasingly harder to develop those capabilities. So integrating commercial solutions as part of much larger projects, that is an open-ended question right now. Maybe one worth pursuing, but again, under that framework of a clear strategy or policy direction that would be guided by the White House, authorized and appropriated by the Congress, something that is moving everybody forward and is a good, allows us to be good stewards of the taxpayer's dollar.
All right, and with that, I think we're going to wrap our panel up. I want to thank our panelists for an amazing set of presentations.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Rich, and all of our distinguished and wonderful panelists for that conversation. Very enlightening. And we appreciate all of you being here. We know you have a lot of important things going on, so we're glad you could join us here today.